Hey everyone, me and Scott back again for part two of this end of season ranking for the 2021 season of Legends of Canton. Last time it was the NFC, this time it's going to be the AFC. It's going to be pretty much the same format as before. We split this in half because we realized that the other one was an hour. So I'm sure most of you don't want to sit through 2 hours. So hopefully this is a little bit more bite-sized this way. A thing I wanted to mention last time is there's a ton of information on all these slides. So not only will I post the podcast, I'm also going to post all of these PDFs so you can flip through them yourself instead of having to pause this. You can see it all kind of collectively that way. So this is another reminder, the playoff bracket, just how things shook out a little bit. Obviously, a lot of these teams are in different divisions and different conferences now. So I'm excited to see people defending their division titles and then having new rivalries.
And just to help the listeners and viewers, when we talk about the AFC, the teams that are in the rankings we have are the teams that are in the AFC as it's currently comprised. But we're looking at last year's performance. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Good point on that. So this is really the only screen that might be a little bit confusing because it's how the divisions shook out last year, just to kind of see what the division races were, how close other teams were to making the playoffs. But ultimately, when we get to the next section, it is going to be any team that realigned or stayed in the AFC. So to start here, AFC East, this was my division. It was a really tight race between my team, Gunslingers, and the Yankees, which is now the Eskimos. So as you can see, it was kind of battling it out towards like week 5. And then it was really anyone's race all the way down going there. So that was relatively tight. The tightest by far was the AFC Central. A lot of lead changes there. Surprisingly, Portland Thunder, who now is New Mexico Stars, and the Brigade. I don't know how they didn't make the playoffs, but they were neck and neck there with the Reds throughout that whole thing. And then the last division is the AFC West. 2 teams made the playoffs there, the Tigers and the Steagles, and they kind of ran away with it relatively early. But the Bulldogs and the Crush still had kind of decent numbers as far as some of these divisions having one team that's a little bit lower. In this one, all 4 teams were relatively competitive. So I'm going to go through this methodology briefly. If you want a little bit more in depth, you can look at the NFC one, but I will just kind of gloss over some of this stuff. Basically, what we're looking at is the overall number is going to be a combination of your starters and your depth. So the starters is what you actually scored last year based on week to week values. Like these players actually scored these points. With depth, I looked closer at the positions, what their end of season scores were. And then I took a certain amount of players per position just to figure out, for example, quarterbacks would have 3 of those, wide receivers would have 6, linebackers would have 6. I did it based off of what the overall kind of layout for the entire league was, the distribution. So positions that typically had more on their roster had a higher value that I accumulated, and ones that had less had fewer. And another way that some of the numbers might be lower is if you didn't necessarily have as many players there, and therefore maybe you only started one player in that position each week. So that's why your numbers are lower. So top 26 is relatively self-explanatory. Regardless of position, it's your top 26 players. That was actually used to determine the draft order. So you're probably familiar with that. That's in your head. That's most likely how you had these teams ranked. I went over the starter and the depth, but we'll get a little bit deeper into it as well. offense and defense separated. So offensive starters and offensive depth, you put those together, you get the overall. Different combinations of that, as you'll see in the next page. Another thing I wanted to mention, like last time, this is really just how you performed last year. This isn't any indication of how you're going to perform this coming year. We didn't really factor in anything such as trades or what draft picks you have or anything like that. So this is just strictly quantitative with a little bit of mine and Scott's commentary to make it a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, and the one little bit of hindsight analytics that I did do, because I mentioned this last time too, so I won't belabor it too long. I was curious to see where the rankings that I did preseason succeeded and failed and the reasons for that. So I did go back and look at every team's top 10 picks, player by player, and seeing how many games each team missed due to injury for just those top 10 picks. I also looked at your draft capital change in terms of your first, second, and third round picks. Because I ended up doing a whole regression analysis and finding that, surprise, surprise, teams that traded away draft capital tended to overperform expectations because their team improved since when I did the rankings. And teams that were decimated by injuries tended to underperform their ranking. And, again, that makes sense. So sometimes I'll sprinkle some of those things in, a little bit of the what could have been or why it wasn't that way, just to provide a little bit of context for some of these teams.
Great. So this is kind of just the Rosetta Stone of what all of this stuff means. At the top is the most important number, the overall ranking. That factors all of this stuff in. It's pretty much an average of, the overall ranking is an average of starter and depth. So it's split 50-50. The number under the overall ranking is Scott's preseason ranking, just so that we could see how these things actually shook out, how accurate he was, and Scott will either celebrate the ones that he was close on or explain why he thinks that they were off. And then, as I mentioned before, the three most important ones on the left side, top 26 starters depth. We break it down into offense and defense in the middle. And then on the right side, we break it down by actual position. And in parentheses, it's how many players of each position were factored into this. So it's taking the total number of points for end of season points and comparing it to the rest of the league. I also had top 8 finishes and bottom 8 finishes, figuring out how victory points were determined in that way. We also have a little chart. It's kind of generic here, but it's going to show week to week how you scored compared to the league average. So the league average is going to be the line and your points are going to be the bar graph. And then to make it easy just to recognize as quickly as possible, blue is going to be you were in the top third of the league, so top 8 in that particular category. And then red is going to be the bottom third, the bottom 8, just so that you could quickly look and say, okay, there's a lot of blue here, they must be good. There's a lot of red, they must need improvement. So right here, we're going to start with number 24, and that is the Miami Hooters. He ended up with one of the top picks this year. I think he has 101 right now because he traded with Maroons from 2 to 1. So with this, you can see that relatively towards the bottom in actually at the bottom for starters in depth, particularly in defense. But if you break it down to actual positions, you can see that his wide receivers were really, really good. And his tight ends were relatively good too. What really dragged him down was quarterbacks and running backs. And then same thing with defense. He had a couple positions that were actually okay, but linebackers and safeties make up a lot of this. So if those are lower, obviously that's going to lower your overall score for defense.
Yeah, and this is a team coming into the season. There weren't really high expectations for. Just the roster is built from a dynasty perspective. It wasn't built from a 2021 season perspective. When you look at the quarterback room, it's, Mac Jones, who overperformed expectations, I think it's fair to say, but that's the quarterback room for all intents and purposes going into last year. The wide receiver room is just phenomenal when you look back at last year's roster. And there is some, what might have been when you look at him having Dobbins, ETN, and McCaffrey as the running backs. Had they been healthy, that running back number would have been high, much higher. I don't see a path that this team would have been, one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the league. But I think that, hovering around the trend line, getting above the trend line more often could have easily taken place of that. He was overall a little bit higher in injuries to top players than average. Some of the guys he picked up via trade after they were already injured. So all those games don't necessarily count for that evaluation I'm doing. But yeah, I mean, this is a team that is either the youngest or second youngest in the entire league if you go through and look, I would guess. And so, it didn't have a great performance last year, but I don't think the goal was to necessarily win the league last year. The goal was to get a bunch of young players who are going to come into their own this year and next year and the following year, even if it meant not doing well last year.
And that is one thing that I overlooked. It bears repeating. His running backs were basically all hurt. And those are some big name players that you named. I really think if they played, that running back room is probably top 10. And then his offense is probably middle of the road. And really his only weakness would be quarterback. And that's something that maybe not this year, but most years you can fix that if you have a high draft pick. So number 23 is the Pottsville Maroons. Kind of similar towards the bottom for a lot of this, primarily because of offense. It gets a little bit better with defense, particularly the defensive line. Actually, the number 1 defensive end starters and really good defensive tackles. What hurt this team was those skill positions: quarterback, running back, wide receiver. The quarterbacks, if you look at it though, they really just didn't get playing time, kind of similar to how we mentioned Steamer in the NFC podcast. Obviously Watson didn't play, but she also has Fields and Lance, and they didn't get as much playing opportunities last year. Obviously those are the guys now. So that's 3 top quarterbacks right there, likely putting that into the top 5, at the very least top 10. So given a different situation, or given this year at least, that offense would be a lot better. And I definitely think there's building blocks there, especially on defense.
Yeah, and this is another team that, again, I don't think was really designed to win last season. I had them ranked at 23rd. And again, when I say I had them ranked, it's really Fantasy Pros and historical comp data I had them ranked, because all I did is I looked at, if you had, QB 13, how QB 13 usually performs, and plugged that into a formula. So when I say my rankings, it's my formula that I use, but it's all other people's expert consensus ratings and then the historical performance data there. But this is another one of those teams that, for key injuries, I see you have here Cam Akers, who she acquired through trade. But if you really go through and look at all of her top 10 picks, and this is also including Lance, who wasn't always injured but didn't play, Watson, who was suspended but not injured. She had 49 games missed among her top 10 players. That's the 3rd most in the league last year. So this is a team, tempered expectations going in, decimated by injuries. Tua didn't perform like some people hoped he would, including me, since I have the other copy. And there were just some other little things like that probably pulled her overall score down here. But again, really deep quarterback room. This is one of those ones where quarterback is a hard position to solve if you have problems, unless you just happen to have 2 players who were waiting in the wings to be starters this season. And, she could go to having even the number 1 overall quarterback room next year, if you look at some of the projections that are out there for Lance and Watson currently.
So number 21, and as we mentioned before, in the NFC, it gets sprinkled through a little bit. So that's why it might look like we're skipping numbers. Number 21 is the Cleveland Crush. We start to get a little bit better here. Overall, still in the 20s, but offense is definitely pretty solid here. What dragged this team down certainly was defense, ranking 23rd overall defense. But yeah, I mean, quarterbacks and wide receiver are really solid here. Running back is good enough. Tight end was weak. That can obviously be fixed. But if you look at the defense, there's not a single depth position that is better than 18. So, I mean, me and Scott will disagree on this as far as what's more important, offense or defense. I think defense is exponentially easier to solve than offense. I don't want to tell people how to draft, but I think it's going to be obvious that most of the first couple rounds are going to be offense. So you can fix defense at a relatively low cost, whether it's trades or drafting. So it is, in my opinion, it is better to kind of build that foundation of offense. So there's definitely an opportunity here to fix it without putting in like a crazy amount of effort.
Yeah, and to be fair here, we are on the same page in terms of offense versus defense. I even wrote a startup draft guide that's out there on Reddit for leagues like this. And I talk about, you got to prioritize offense. You got to keep hitting offense. But I think, whereas I'm someone who in a startup draft would start looking at defense around maybe round 12 or 13, you're more of a 19 or 20 kind of guy. So it's just the degree to which we prioritize offense over defense is where we have some discrepancies there. But largely in agreement with you. This defense was just abysmal last year. If you look at their players, some of it was underperforming. Tremaine Edmonds almost cracked 200, and 200 is kind of one of those magical numbers that you hope for, especially with IDPs. Miles Jack, who I've liked forever, and he breaks my heart year after year, either because of injury or underperformance. Harold Landry did ball out for him, over 300 points, but that was his only 300-point scorer. I believe not on the other side of the ball, because he had Najee and my boy Joey Burrow. But yeah, it was really the defense that pulled everything down here. And again, there's some youth. Jamin Davis is someone who there were a lot of expectations going into last year. I think it's way too early to call him a bust, but he definitely didn't become that plug and play linebacker that a lot of folks thought he would be going into the year last year. But again, defense, I agree, is much more solvable than offense, but it's something that you can't just summarily ignore. And I think this is a good example of an extreme version of that.
So number 20, one of our new owners, this is the Houston Oilers. What's interesting here is the top 26 picks were ranked 10th, but I think that was a lot of trades that happened. So last year, this team wasn't able to actually reap the benefits of having those players throughout the year. So that kind of skewed the top 26 and therefore probably messed up his draft position a little bit. Overall on this, as you can see, if you look over at the positions, you would look at it and say, I have no idea why he's ranked 20th. Look at all of these blue numbers. Wide receiver and linebacker is such a big core component of building these teams, because most teams have a ton of wide receivers and a ton of linebackers. If memory serves correct, I think this team was only starting one linebacker every single week, and there's really nothing on that roster. So, I mean, even just putting in warm bodies to be at linebacker, I think would overall boost up this team. So 20 seems like it's a little deceptive here, because you might have the roster in front of you, but quarterbacks were number one, because I think there was 4 starting quarterbacks on his roster. Running backs were very high too. Defensive tackle is very high, safety is very high. So there's definitely pieces there. if moves were to be made with trades or even just shoring up a couple of these positions of need. You can even see the first half of the season kind of right down the middle, league average, looking fine. It was just kind of towards the end started to tail off.
Yeah, and I think the biggest discrepancy here between where the preseason rankings thought he was going to shake out and where it ended up is just like you said, it's that lack of depth at wide receiver and especially linebacker. At the end of last year, there were only 4 linebackers on the entire roster. Willie Gay is a guy who had expectations, didn't quite do it. Kenneth Murray, people who invested a first or second round rookie pick in him a couple of years ago are still waiting for him to turn on, and he didn't crack 50 points last year. So the linebackers really crushed him. The wide receiver room, I'm looking at Robbie Anderson, Mecole Hardman, Darnell Mooney, who had a nice season, Darius Slayton, who took a major step backwards. He just had a lot of guys that underperformed. And then the running back room, which was good, you had Zeke and Mixon, McCaffrey, but McCaffrey had injury issues. Fortunately, he was smart and had Hubbard. But yeah, it was, if you remember my rankings, depth was a part of it. And that quarterback depth was something that really boosted his score and probably overcompensated for a lack of depth at linebacker and at wide receiver. But you can only start 2 of those quarterbacks, and he did have 4: Cousins, Murray, Rodgers, and Wentz, and just didn't have a lot in some other spots. So I think that's why, went in with high expectations. If you look at my ranking compared to the top 26, it's actually pretty close. But the difference is just where that depth was and how much of it he could use on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah. So number 18 is the Baltimore Stallions. We're starting to get a little bit more middle of the pack for some of these rankings. Offense is obviously a little bit better than defense here. I guess, like I said, a lot of these positions are pretty much right down the middle. Tight end was a little bit better. Linebacker was quite good here. Just a couple positions that didn't quite work out to lower him down. What's kind of sticking out like a sore thumb for me is that red 19 on running backs. So the points that he got from his starting running backs were relatively low, but like some of these positions, defensive tackle and linebacker, defensive tackle and cornerback, those are relatively easy to fix. And you look at kind of what he did in the first half of the season, a lot of these scores were well above the league average. So it's just enough low weeks to kind of overall sink him below average.
Yeah, and it was just unfortunate that DT. One of the complaints about IDP in general is how much variance there is and how it's hard to predict who's going to be successful or who isn't. A lot of those complaints come from those 2 positions, from defensive tackles and corners. The website IDP Guys has a great weekly streaming article on just streaming corners because they are largely interchangeable. You could probably do the same type of thing with defensive tackles if you dug into the right kind of data. So I think this is something that, just a little bit of bad luck in terms of the guys that were on the team not performing, a little bit of, maybe he was doing some streaming and that doesn't get reflected in the final season rankings because some of those guys that he was using at defensive tackle or corner might have just been sort of transitional guys that were on the roster at one point and started to perform some weeks, but not all others, because as you can see, he had some pretty solid weeks right around or above the overall line there. But, like the defensive tackle and the corner are the things that stick out the most to me, but those are the most fixable kinds of issues. If you just, toss IDP Guys $3 a month or something, you can get access to those streaming things. And yeah, it's overall a solid team. It's got some good parts and some good expectations going into last year, but kind of a middle of the pack performance.
One thing, I haven't been mentioning this too much, but like I said, I'll have all of these slides available in a PDF so folks can flip through it and look at it in more detail. But everyone, I kind of mentioned who their best ad was, whether it was a trade or waiver wire. And he really didn't make any moves, whether trades or pickups. James Prochet was his best pickup, and I don't think he really scored any points. So if he wanted to be a little aggressive and pick up cornerbacks or pick up defensive tackles, those numbers might go up. So number 16, the Barcelona Dragons. Now we're starting to get a little bit better for some of these positions. So offense was in the top 10. Again, this is another example of defense dragging them down a little bit. I guess in particular on offense, quarterback was not great, running back was not great, but wide receiver is very good. Top 2 right there for starter, 4 for depth. Defensive line is very good for both of those positions. What drags them down for defense is some of these other positions where a lot of people had many starters, so linebacker and safety. But ultimately, obviously for me, my philosophy is build around wide receiver. So has a very good wide receiver room here.
Yeah, and he basically went with a zero RB strategy, or the dynasty equivalent of that. I mean, he had Boobie Sanders, who by all accounts underperformed last year, but had really high hopes. And I was just listening to a podcast today where there's still high hopes for him among some parts of the fantasy community. But he also had Leonard Fournette, who vastly overperformed expectations last year. But that was really it. Beyond that, it was Sony Michel, Ty Johnson, Jerick McKinnon, let's see who else, Boston Scott, Benny Snell. So he went in with a strategy that he's only going to play 1 to 2 running backs a week. And when one of those guys tends to be, nicked up a lot of the season or underperform like Sanders did, that's going to really hurt that score. And it's going to end up, dragging your overall down a little bit more than it necessarily should. But, great quarterbacks in Trevor Lawrence and Russ Wilson, good top 26 numbers. But I think, it was some of those things. And again, the safeties, just a thin safety room. And, I'm a big Amani Hooker fan. I have him in several leagues, but when Jordan Fuller went out and all he had was Hooker left, that was definitely a knock on that room, and that hurt that depth because there really wasn't much beyond that.
All right. Number 15 is the Richmond Rebels. Very good offense here, particularly with the depth. Number 2 overall for offensive depth. This is becoming a pattern. Defense might not be defense wins championships, but defense can certainly make you not make the playoffs. So his defense was ranked towards the bottom here, despite his offense being great. Just across the board, his depth, you can see, is all blue numbers, particularly quarterback, running back. Starters were more right down the middle, but all of his depth is very, very good on offense. For defense, he started to have a couple positions that were lagging behind. Defensive tackle, safety, linebacker was okay, but defensive end was very good. So again, a couple positions will drag you down for the overall either defense or offense or defense. So I guess the overall story we're kind of painting here is you should at least be serviceable everywhere. If you have a couple really weak spots, that might drag down some of your strengths.
Yeah, and this is one of those teams where, I know that my ranking was pretty close to where he shook out, whether it's with your evaluation or that top 26. But I still went back and, like I said, looked at all the teams, and this was one of the ones that was hit pretty hard by injuries. So again, the league average in terms of how many games your top 10 players missed, top 10 draft picks missed, was 29. He was at 40. So he was above that average, and it seemed to hit him in some very specific places. Like Kareem Hunt missed a handful of games. Akers, you have here, missed the whole year until the playoffs. But this is a team that really solid wide receiver room, by and large, really solid in a lot of places. And so that's why they were able to overcome some of the defensive deficiencies that were there. And even on defense, there's a couple of really solid players. I'm looking at Nick Bosa there, Shaq Thompson, who's another one of those really solid plug and play guys. But a few of the other spots definitely pulled him down a little bit. And the offense wasn't able to fully compensate for the defensive struggles, especially given the injuries that predominantly hit him on the offensive side. And there's, the whole Trey Sermon thing where, what the hell was that? Now they draft another running back this year, and we have no idea what's going to end up happening with him. But he's a guy that, in redraft, people were talking about him as an RB2. And then Elijah Mitchell emerged and he got in the doghouse, and, just a couple of these things. And despite that, he still had the number 8 rated running back starters and 7. And that's with Sermon and Cam Akers, just sort of floating out there. But, overall, I think this was a really solid team, and just had some bad breaks and some maybe self-inflicted wounds on defense, and not shoring up some spots. But again, when you have offense, you can always trade for defense, and it's always easier to fix defense. So, about expected performance last year. And, I think I predicted them to go to the playoffs when we did our late season podcast. And I think what ended up holding them back was, again, just kind of those injuries coupled with some of the defensive performances.
So I'd like to point out, we have you on record saying that defense is easy to fix.
Easier. I'm sorry. If I forgot an there, defense is easier to fix than
okay.
Offense. Yeah.
Okay. So you agree with me. Sounds good. Now we make a big jump. Number 11, this is Scott's team, the Pittsburgh Maulers. Overall, kind of middle of the road. What hurt him was offense. Defense is very good. We actually thought that he was going to win his division last year, the NFC Central. And then at the last second, the Outlaws swooped in and took that from you. So now me and you are in the same division. So playoffs are going to be hard again. But so you do have a lot of positions that are towards the top. Your running back depth is very good. Tight end, starter, and depth, very good. Defensive tackle. There's nothing here that's actually really a weakness besides I see the stray red mark here is wide receiver depth, but overall everything is decent. It's kind of just one of those things where it's a couple of tweaks here and there, a couple players performing better, a couple less injuries going on. And actually, I think it really is consistency, because if you look at what you scored week to week, some of those are way, way above the league average, and then some of those are relatively low. So it was kind of a roller coaster ride going through that. So you had 6 top 8 finishes and 5 bottom 8 finishes, and then a lot that were kind of right down the middle. So I think it was probably week to week, you were like, how many victory points am I going to get? So that's why it came down to the end.
Yeah. And I got to be honest, I'm disappointed with how the team ended up performing there at the end. When I see that wide receiver depth, I just see Juju Smith-Schuster and Will Fuller. And that's kind of the what could have been. Part of my interest in injuries is I felt like I had a lot. And so I tried to quantify that. And it turned out I had the second most in the league in terms of my top 10 picks. And again, if you would extend further, some people might jump me, I might jump them. But my quarterback depth was killed early in the season when Fitzpatrick was out, when he was expected to at least put up Taylor Heineke type numbers, which would have helped those things. Gus Edwards was nobody, and then he was somebody, and then he got hurt. So, there was just a lot of missed opportunities for the squad there. And I was also slow to react. I thought that I built a team with enough depth to withstand the injuries, and so I didn't get very active in the trade market. I only traded away 1 second-round pick, and that was very late in the season when it looked like either Wentz or Tua might miss some games as I was trying to make my playoff run. So I picked up Jimmy G for a second. But I really was not proactive enough in trying to overcome injuries that I had. And so, this is a what could have been type thing, but I'm satisfied with where I am.
Another big jump is number 7, the Philadelphia-Pittsburgh Steagles. He made the wild card. He was second in the AFC West. Now we're getting into really, really good. So top 8 for starters and depth, particularly on the strength of his offense. Quarterback and running back specifically, one of the best running back groups. Wide receiver, not as good, but not enough to knock down some of these other positions. Tight end could use some work towards the bottom there. Overall defense is solid enough. Besides defensive end, that's one that stands out as near the bottom of the league, but very good cornerbacks, very good defensive tackle. And if you look at his weekly numbers, he was consistently above the average. So obviously that contributed to making the playoffs. I know that in the AFC in particular, it was really, really neck and neck. I think it was teams that missed the playoffs. It was by a matter of like 2 victory points. So, it was really anyone's game, but ultimately he came out on top.
Yeah, and when I look at this team, I think that he was able to largely perform or even exceed some things when you look at his top 26 ranking versus his my preseason ranking, his in-season rankings. He's another team that did get hit really hard with injuries. Again, league average 29. He was at 45, but he was more proactive in addressing those things in the trade market. So he made the same number of trades as my team, but I gave up a little bit more draft capital to plug some holes and probably just even made some smarter trades than the couple of trades that I did make there. So, he was a team that had a solid squad, started to get dinged up a little bit, and then was able to backfill them. The only place that I agree with you completely is the defensive ends. And then the tight ends too. I was looking at what happened there because, he had a really, really high ranking in my preseason ranking, but he had Logan Thomas. And Logan Thomas, everyone expected to be a top 6 tight end, top 8, I guess, if you're, being really negative on him. And, because of injuries, he didn't score he scored 67 points. And so then he had to plug in Kyle Rudolph and roll with Rudolph for most of the rest of the season. And then Darren Waller was another guy you're very familiar with. You go into the season with Darren Waller and Logan Thomas, you think you've got one of the top 5 tight end groups in the league. And then you just get dinged up by injuries. And next thing you know, you're in the sad position of starting Kyle Rudolph down a playoff stretch. So, and defensive end, largely the same. Bud Dupree didn't put up the numbers that he put up in 20. Again, a lot of that was injury for him too. But even one player performing up to expectations there or playing up to their past performance, and that number would have increased. But overall, he had a really solid season. So the places where he has red there are pretty understandable when you look at his roster composition. And yeah, I know he probably didn't go as far in the playoffs as he would have liked, but overall, it was I'd call that a pretty successful season.
Yeah. Do you have his roster in front of you?
Yeah.
I remember quarterbacks in particular he waited on. I think Brady was one of them that he has. So I was during the startup, I was like, what is he doing? Why does he keep passing on quarterbacks? It didn't matter because his quarterbacks were top 8.
Yeah,
So
most of that's Brady. Brady.
yeah, right. So ride that while it's still going hot.
Yeah, and I mean, I know we're not doing prognosticating for this season, but he had to be just sweating in April because his two quarterbacks were Brady and Roethlisberger. Roethlisberger retires, thank God. That should have happened years ago. And Brady retires, and all of a sudden he's looking at no quarterbacks this year. Then Brady unretires, and the Steelers happen to backfill with Mitch Trubisky, who happens to be on the Steelers roster. So he's coming into this year again with two quarterbacks when at one point this offseason he had none. So it'll be interesting to see, what he does in the offseason. And but yeah, that was just a fun little side note since you brought up his quarterback room.
Mhm. So number 6, the Cincinnati Reds. He was actually the Super Bowl champion. And he came in first in the AFC Central, which in my opinion was the most difficult division, with Portland Thunder and Rochester Brigade right there. His starters are one of the best, number 3 in starters. Depth is a little bit lower, but the strength of his starters, both on offense and defense, is what helped him here. Number 4 offensive starters, number 6 defensive starters. Defensive depth is what's holding him back a little bit from being higher than 6 overall. So that could use some more improvement. But you look at his positions, running back and tight end, top 4 for both of those. So that was really high. He's another team that quarterback was a little bit low. Those numbers should be red. Those are in the 20s, but he overcame that with running back and tight end, and his wide receivers are fine too. Linebacker and cornerback towards the top as well, especially starters. So that made his defense pretty good there. Really, the only reds are, like I said, quarterback should be red right there, and then defensive end. Safeties, the depth isn't great, but his starters were fine. And then if you look at what he did for the season, he was doing relatively well throughout, staying a little bit above the league average. But you look at those last, 6 weeks, 5 out of 6 of those were way above league average. So he got hot exactly when he needed to get hot. And that's what was able to get him his Super Bowl win.
Yeah, he was on absolute fire there at the end. And this is one team that, I think had a really smart roster composition given the format that we have. So he went into the season with Josh Allen and Ryan Fitzpatrick as his starting quarterbacks. So only having 2 when a lot of teams would try to have 3. But he had so much depth on offense, and this modified best ball format that we have, you might only start 1 quarterback in a week, but if you backfill with an extra wide receiver or tight end, and one of them goes off, and they can easily put up quarterback type numbers. And that's what we saw for the Reds week after week, especially there towards the end, where this is a team that had enough horsepower on offense to overcome the quarterbacks there. And then for defensive ends, I was surprised that this was so low, because I know him from other leagues, and he's a really good defensive drafter. He's one of the more defensive-minded owners that I think I play with. And then I saw Chase Young, and that explains it. Chase Young would have been there. That one guy, it's like a TJ Watt situation. If you plug TJ Watt into this roster, he goes from 20 and 24 to top 10 in both starters and depth by virtue of that one guy. Chase Young is also that kind of guy. So I think this team was built really well. They overperformed if you look at the playoffs, but when you look at their actual position by position breakdown, spot on, solid team. And I've got to give a lot of credit to the way the team was built. It was a risky strategy in the quarterback room, but it's one that absolutely paid off.
All right. So number 5 is the Chicago Tigers. He was the number 1 seed in the AFC. Very, very good. So he had the highest victory points in the AFC. Now we're getting into top five for a lot of these things. Mostly the power of his defense. I remember he was really hammering those top 10 linebackers. He probably had more linebackers than he was able to start. Just very, very good. So linebacker and safety are really the core of this style of ranking. So nailed it on both of those. Quarterbacks very good, tight ends very good. Both of those in the top 6 or 7, top 3 or 4 for quarterback and tight end respectively. Surprisingly, running back relatively low at 22, and then defensive end relatively low, even though he really focused on defense. Those two positions were a little bit lower. If those improved, he might have been closer to number 1 or number 2. But overall, very, very good team. Those are the positions I build around. For me, quarterback, wide receiver, linebacker, and he has all of those covered. You look at his week to week. His week 1 is almost literally off the charts. So I think it was like 501, and the chart only goes up to 500. So he week 1, he set the record for most points scored in the season. So that was kind of hard to top after that. Obviously, he still did very well. Did a little bit lower towards the end. So that's why he didn't have like most points scored, because it started to tail off. But yeah, to me, this is probably number 2, number 3 best team in the league, despite some of these numbers.
Yeah, and I noticed the key injuries there, none, and the numbers sort of bear that out a little bit. He had 19 top 10 player games missed due to injury. That's tied for 5th lowest in the league. So he stayed healthy. The reason why, and it's weird to say he underperformed, given he's number 5 and was number 1 overall seed. But the reason why I think some of your ranking and the top 26 ranking are a little bit lower than what I had preseason is just some guys underperformed. If you look at his roster, his running backs, which are a little bit lower, Josh Jacobs and DeAndre Swift, both of those expected to be top 10 running backs going into last year. If we can, think back, had good seasons, decent seasons, but not top 10 seasons for either of them. Wide receivers, OBJ, Antonio Brown, DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins was probably the biggest fantasy disappointment of last year. Antonio Brown, it's hard to believe that we had faith in him at one point, even just a year ago, but we did. His first few games were on fire. He's a big part of that spike in the beginning of the season there. And then on defense, that defensive end, I tried to dig into that a little bit because I remember he had a really high defensive ranking. He had JJ Watt, who missed almost all of the year, and Khalil Mack, who missed almost all of the year. And again, those guys are definitely past their prime. I don't think anyone would argue with that. But you put those in, and they have even a gradual decline kind of season, and those numbers get boosted a lot too. So by no fault of his own, he just happened to have some guys that underperformed, but he had built a roster that was strong enough to overcome that. And while guys were underperforming, he wasn't really riddled with injuries, especially not at the top end of his roster. And that's another reason why he was able to sustain some of that underperformance and overall put together a really solid year.
So number 1 is...
Now we get to the whole reason you made these rankings.
I promise this is not rigged. I promise you. I have the numbers to back them up. If anyone wants to see that. I'm going to let Scott talk about this because I just don't want to make it seem like I'm bragging about this. So Scott, you could talk about it and then I'll pipe in a little bit.
Hey, I was happy to talk about my own team. So feel free to talk about yours. But
I already feel like I'm making it seem like, hey guys, I have the best team. I'm glad you watched this hour-long podcast.
Yeah, no, this is by far my biggest miss. If you look at my preseason rankings compared to top 26 and your rankings. And so this is a big part of of why I decided to dig into the data the way that I did. And you put together a good team. 16 would have been right in the middle, and if you had your roster as it was originally composed, had an average number of injuries, you still could have easily cracked the top 10. However, you had three things that really, really worked well for you. One, Devondre Campbell was linebacker 3 last year, and you got him in the 33rd round. So that was one just massive overperformance that nobody saw coming. That was probably the biggest overperformance of all year, and you happen to have him on your team. So good for you for having that foresight to get him. But the other two things are you had the second fewest injuries among your top 10 draft picks. So you were able to avoid a lot of those big ones. And you were the most active trader in the league. So despite having few injuries, you are constantly looking for ways to improve your team. Usually teams have injuries and then try to overcome or have players that underperform. And I know you were dealing with some underperformance in the beginning of the year. That's why I think you've flip-flopped Brandon Ayuk 6 or 7 times now, and he's back on your roster, I think. But he was an underperformer in the beginning of the year. And you say, hey, if you're underperforming, you're off my roster. And so this is a team that had tied for the biggest draft capital change, and that you moved your first, second, and third round pick this year during last season, 8 total trades, few injuries. I mean, that's the perfect recipe for an overperformance like this. And it's overperformance, not in terms of, your team did better than it should have, and overperformance in terms of you beating expectations because your roster is so different than it was whenever we originally created those expectations. I should say I created those expectations, and that's how you ended up shaking out like this. But to just bang on you a little bit here, defensive tackles, what are you doing? 20, corners, 23, 19. I know you don't believe in those positions, but if you can get some points out of them. I think at one point you were out of free agent dollars, so you're having to trade 10th and 9th round picks to even plug in anyone to play at the corner position.
That happened. Yep.
So yeah, I think you're already number one. So I'm not going to try to tell you how to improve your team, but just trying to understand some of the red numbers there. I know you were experimenting a little bit with some defensive tackle streaming. Austin Johnson came out of nowhere and overperformed and helped you out a lot there. But yeah, overall, congratulations. Even though you didn't win the league, you had statistically the best season last year, and it's a lot due to all the work you did after the draft.
Yeah, and I think looking back at my draft, everyone kind of beats themselves up about things. I had a lot of picks that I thought sucked, and I felt like I needed to trade to improve some of these things. Getting Cooper Kupp was a big help. Deebo Samuel was kind of later, and he came out doing really well. And then I personally thought that I probably had the worst tight ends after the startup because I waited so long for Higbee. And then Schultz came out of nowhere. So that helped me immensely too. And I mean, the way that I build my teams are quarterback, wide receiver, linebacker. And I mean, though, from the results, you can see that those are the things that I feel like kind of elevate the team. And then you kind of just backfill in with other positions. Cornerbacks, I don't even think I had 4. I think I only have 3. I also I think everyone on my roster was someone I picked up mid-season. So even if I got them I got them like at the end of the startup, I was like, these people don't exist. Cornerback will stay at the bottom. I'm never going to use more than 1. So that explains that. No offense to anyone who loves cornerbacks or knows any cornerbacks in real life, but I don't really care about them.
Yeah, and cornerbacks are kind of a really tricky thing because I mentioned a lot of them are interchangeable, a lot of them are streamable. But when you go back and look at the rankings, both the AFC and the NFC, the teams that had some of those consistent, really top corners were able to use that for a competitive advantage. It's just like any position, even if there's a lot of interchangeability in the middle and in the end, if you have the top ones, that's going to get you some extra points every week compared to your opponents. So yeah, even if you only have one or two on your roster, you just you gotta hit. And this is a position where it's easier to hit. But yeah, I get your strategy. The zero CB strategy is one that I think can be used to a lot of profit, as you did here. And yeah, overall, nice job.
Thanks. One thing I will say that kind of contradicts everything that I said about cornerbacks. I did find it that there were so many times where I started a cornerback in an early game and they put up a goose egg, and then I'm like, oh shit, I better swap someone out in my 4 substitutions just to even get like 5 points. So there is something to be said about not putting yourself in a bad position to only have started one of something. You probably, a lot of positions you probably want to have at least 2 of. So cornerback was one that I risked a lot. If I looked back, I guarantee you there was probably 3 or 4 weeks that I scored 0 at cornerback, and it is what it is. Cause it's like, do I sub in a cornerback to get me 6 points? Or do I hope one of my backup players at a different position just has a really good game? Any other thoughts overall, Scott?
No, this was fun. It's always nice to look back on what happened and why it happened and how it compares to some other things. But really just looking forward to the rookie draft coming up and all the league activity, the trades, some of them blockbuster, the team name changes is always fun to see too. And having a couple of new owners, this is probably my favorite part of the fantasy football season. The actual season is kind of nerve wracking, but this is the stuff where it's fun. This is the part of Dynasty. This is why I like Dynasty so much more than redraft, is just this process of building your team and making changes and making improvements. But I just got to remember to follow your game plan and some of the other teams that did very well, and to not stop making improvements once the season starts.
Right.
So I think that's a big lesson. If you look at some of the most active traders, it's a bimodal distribution, because a lot of teams that were heavy traders were trading away assets to get draft capital. But if you look at the teams that did the most trades, they're the top and the bottom of the league by and large. Because when you're more active, you're improving your roster. How sustainable that is, we'll see. That Rams model definitely paid off for them. I say that really begrudgingly last year, but it definitely paid off for you and paid off for some others who went heavy in last year. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing different strategies play out, seeing what people thought about this, and really looking forward to the draft getting kicked off here on Sunday.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for bearing with us. I know this was really long. I know it was 2 parts, so hopefully we didn't lose you along the way. Like I said, I'm going to post this as a PDF so you can look at it more closely, kind of dig into some of the more information about your team. Ultimately, I hope this can be used as a little bit of a guide to see what you can do to improve your team. Hopefully it sparks the interest to do a bunch of trades, because that's always the most fun part for me. So I hope everyone enjoyed this. Really looking forward to the draft in about a week. I'll send out an email for that with more information, but it's going to start on Sunday at noon. So stay tuned for more information on that.